recast of the entire broadcast is just not feasible, not with 20 hours already in the can and 5 more hours coming tonight. But we are going to try and sum up some of the things that have been covered to give you an idea, or perhaps more importantly, to refresh the memory of those who are just tuning back into that and have perhaps had their minds elsewhere or have not heard all 4 of the other broadcasts yet, or whatever the case might be. Again, to explain to those of you who just tuned in and have heard us explaining a lot of things about the nature of the show and the nature of the kind of broadcasting we do on these archive broadcasts, we want to stress that this is a very special and specific broadcast tonight. This is the last of a 5-part series on what we call the Mediterranean merry-go-round. I can't even say it, and the show's barely started. And the last broadcast on the Mediterranean merry-go-round that we were going to do in this particular series. And the Mediterranean merry-go-round is a phrase we coined to refer to the entire mess that surrounds the assassination attempt on Pope John Paul II in 1981. Now, you might think, well, you know, it was an attempted assassination. Even if there were conspiracies and weird stuff involved, how complicated could it be? Well, the answer is extremely, and I'm sure that those of you who have been following the show so far realize the truth of what we have said. Those of you who are longtime listeners and are the kind of people who really stay up to date on this stuff will realize that we have had to even leave things out. As a matter of fact, we've had to leave a lot of things out, even with the 25 hours of airtime that we have devoted to these archive broadcasts, because this is probably the largest and most complex political case. I think it even probably leaves in the dust the assassination of John F. Kennedy in terms of complexity, and that was a pretty damn complex case, as those of you who listened to the Guns of November will be aware. But this case goes so far and so wide, and it's involved so many people and so many organizations, and so many bizarre twists and turns are involved that yeah, even we had to edit some stuff in the interest of brevity, which sounds funny when you're talking about 25 hours of radio broadcasting. But to sum up the most important points, basically we are looking at a series of parallel tracks that are only seemingly parallel and are in reality connected. You might almost say there are the above ground tracks and there is the underground railroad that all of them are connected to. But the above-ground tracks are several. One of them, and one of the most important, and one of the things that makes this such an unusual case, is the Vatican itself. And the Vatican, again, as we often say, please don't misconstrue references to the Vatican as being references to the Catholic Church as a whole. The Vatican is a temporal organization. It's an actual city-state. It has its own laws. It has its own rulers. And as with anywhere else, when you have mortal men involved with huge amounts of money, power, and political machinations, you have strange things going on, and that is certainly the case here. So the Vatican is one very important track. Another very, very important track is something called the P2, or the Propaganda Due Masonic Lodge. Again, the Masonic Lodge in this case, this should not be confused with Masonry in general. In this case, Masonry is pretty much secondary in importance. The only important thing as far as Masonry is concerned here is the fact that there's a great deal of secrecy surrounding the inner core of Masonic lodges, and that enabled the people involved in P2, namely a man called Licio Gelli, to recruit and in fact blackmail very powerful people from Italy and other countries, but most particularly Italy, into his Masonic lodge for the purpose of shaping a shadow fascist government of Italy with the interest towards reinstating fascism in Italy. Mussolini, Licio Gelli, a former Mussolini functionary and a former Oberleutnant in the Nazi SS, so a man with some serious qualifications toward a fascist coup. So P2, an organization, a secretive organization of very high-ranking military intelligence, business people, and also, of course, some religious people in Italy, but also in a couple of other countries, and with ties to right-wing movements all over the place. That would be the second of our parallel tracks that we're looking at. The third is an organization that we discussed in depth last week, and that is an organization called STIBAM, S-T-I-B-A-M. STIBAM was probably, at the time of its final rupture, the world's largest guns and drugs smuggling outfit. It had a huge network that worked very closely, apparently, with Western intelligence, as we detailed in quite a bit of depth last week, that worked to bring narcotics, primarily out of the Middle East, through Europe, and with the help of both American or Western intelligence and the Mafia, out of Europe, into South and Central America, and eventually up into the United States, where the illegal arms shipments would start the other direction. And we detailed this quite thoroughly. STIBAM is tied directly into P2 in the Vatican for a variety of reasons, but the most important of which are a lot of the people in Stiebaum were directly connected to P2 people, and most notably, Stiebaum's main offices were in Milan in the same building and linked to, probably for the purposes of laundering money, the Banco Ambrosiano of Milan, the largest private bank in Italy, the chairman of which, Roberto Calvi, was an intimate of Archbishop Paul Marcinkus, head of the Vatican Bank, and Calvi and his earlier mentor, Michele Sindona, were at once the Vatican's most important financial advisors, helping the Vatican to invest its millions and millions of dollars, unfortunately in a variety of very shady and many outright criminal and pro-fascist organizations. At the same time, Calvi and Sindona before him were also working hand in hand with the mafia, with drug peddling and things of that nature, especially Stiebaum in the case of Calvi, and also with Western intelligence. So that's the network that ties Stiebaum to Banco Ambrosiano and the P2, and there also to the Vatican. All of these essentially working in concert, at least quite often working in concert. The last, and the one that we're going to pay the most important attention to, the last of these ties, these parallel tracks, is American and Western intelligence in general, because we're also talking, of course, heavily about Italian intelligence, which was very well represented in the P2 Lodge, in this shadow fascist government, most notably in the person of General Giuseppe Santovito, the head of Super Sismi, a sort of a shadow organization within Sismi, which is Italian military intelligence, also a high-ranking P2 member and involved up to his ears in all of this stuff. Western intelligence in the person of West Germany, which we're going to be talking about, the BND, the former Gehlen organization, and Western intelligence most notably in the shape of the CIA, the American intelligence network, of course, and several members of the CIA and several not-so-well-known CIA collaborators, namely journalists like Michael Adine and Claire Sterling, but also actual operating CIA men like Paul Henze, who we're going to be talking about, we haven't really mentioned yet so far, Theodore Shackley, and Theodore Shackley's protege, Frank Turple, Ed Wilson, and others. So these are all the parallel tracks. Now, how all these tracks were linked together and how they got to St. Peter's Square in time for a very strange man by the name of Mehmet Ali Agca, a Turkish neo-fascist, to detrain and to pump a few bullets into Pope John Paul II is what we're going to be trying to sum up tonight, and how we're going to try and bring all those trains into the station safely by midnight.
Yeah, and even to begin to try and explain how all of these events hook up beyond talking about the parallel tracks, would basically it's taken us 20 hours so far, so we're not going to dwell on that past to sum up in just a couple of minutes. As a result of the association between fascism and the Vatican basically became a very considerable financial and commercial force to be reckoned with. The Vatican finances derived from associating with the Vatican were handled largely by the aforementioned Roberto Calvi and Michele Sindona of the P2 Lodge. Through their association with P2, the Vatican Bank and the Vatican in general became associated with an international network of intrigue, centering primarily around the P2 Lodge, but also intersecting with a couple of related and intersecting organizations called the World Anti-Communist League, which we've talked about before and we'll be talking about again this evening. Also, the Internacional Fascista, another organization that we talked about. We've taken a look at Nazi elements cooperating with all of these things. We'll be taking a look at those same Nazi elements working within this milieu this evening. And again, Western intelligence and their hookups with all of the various things that we've been talking about is going to be the primary focus of the broadcast this evening. Now, last week we left off basically with the very same Western intelligence networks that we're going to be picking up with this evening. Among the elements that we looked at in association with Stiebaum, remember that's a P2-linked arms for drugs ring with the DEA. The head of Stiebaum was an informer for the DEA, the Drug Enforcement Administration, the CIA, a number of contacts between Stiebaum and CIA, including a fellow who used to work with Edwin Wilson, a man named Eugene Bartholomeus. Wilson, of course, is the associate of Frank Turple. We'll be coming back to Turple tonight. Also, a man named Glauco Partel, who worked for the National Security Agency. Partel had contacts with all kinds of individuals, including, among others, the National Security Establishment of the United States, a former Nazi security chief in Rome, and a bunch of other people. Glauco Partel working for the National Security Agency, a missile expert working for Stiebaum. Also, a key name to remember, two key names to remember from the broadcast last time, which might serve as a good place to pick up with this evening. One of them was a man named Bekir Çelenk. Bekir Çelenk was a key member of Stiebaum, according to most accounts, one of the three most important people in it. and Bakir Chilenk was also the paymaster for the plot to shoot the Pope, according to Mehmet Ali Ajah. Another key name is Carlo Palermo. Carlo Palermo was the judge who was investigating Stiebaum, and at the end of the broadcast last week, we took a look at the Pope shooting investigation. As the trial of the Bulgarians got underway, Judge Palermo was almost killed by the explosion of a large car bomb. His escape was fortunate. He almost wound up being added to a long casualty list of judges and judges' relatives that have crossed the P2 nexus in one manner or another. We're going to take a look at yet another of those judicial casualties, I guess you could say, this evening. And also Bakir Chilenk, as a month before the Italian magistrates were going to travel to Turkey to interview Bakir Chilenk in his Turkish prison. Bakir Chilenk died of an apparent heart attack. Henry Arsan, the head of Stiebaum, also died in prison. And contemplating not only the prison deaths of Bakir Chilenk, the prison death of Henry Arsan, also of Michele Sindona of P2, and a great many other people, that's one of the things that should be kept in mind this evening, because Mehmet Ali Ajah wound up staying in prison for a long time, I guess you could say, at the disposal of, and it might have been just exactly that, of the very same P2-linked security services in whose prisons so many of these deaths have taken place.
It should be also mentioned that not only did Mehmet Ali Ajah, and not only has Mehmet Ali Ajah lasted some 5 years in prison while others were dropping like flies in other cells, but Mehmet Ali Ajah has lasted 5 years in prison with perhaps the most bizarre collection of people trooping in and out of his cells that you have ever seen, including Sicilian Mafia, Neapolitan Camorra members, well, Sicilian Mafia folk too, probably, American and Italian Secret Service people, just all kinds of folks have been walking in and out of Ajah's cells, and so far he has managed to escape the fatal poisoning of Michele Sindona, the heart attacks of Chilenk and Arsan and others. He hasn't fallen out of any buildings like some of the unfortunate associates of Roberto Calvi. He hasn't wound up swinging on the end of a rope like Calvi himself. So far, Mehmet Ali Ajah, considering that he is at the center of one of the pivotal cases of the century, politically, has done awfully well. You might remember that Lee Harvey Oswald, protesting his innocence all the way, it also did not make it very long in the Dallas jail. And that Jack Ruby, in another case, similar in the same case, rather, also wound up dying of cancer in his imprisoned state. So we have to ask, just in a general sense, as people who've been studying these kinds of things, what is it that Mehmet Ali Ajah has been doing that has kept him alive so long when others, with all their money and all their power, were not able to make the same claim for very long? Now, one of the most important things about the Bulgarian thesis, and we're going to examine the Bulgarian thesis in some depth tonight, but the most important thing to realize is that the Bulgarian thesis, created as it was apparently by people with direct ties to Western intelligence, is a very specific weapon. The Bulgarian thesis is a weapon that was designed taking very small bits of truth that were established or were hard to ignore, let's put it that way, and shaping these with a whole lot of lies as a weapon pointed at the Soviet Union, but even more importantly than the Soviet Union, pointed at world détente. Okay, it was a weapon that apparently was designed to destroy détente for a variety of reasons. We're going to look at those later on. But now the thing to look at, and the most important thing to take out of the first 4 broadcasts tonight, as you go into this 5th broadcast with us, is to realize that P2, of which many of the folks involved with the Pope and with some of the things that the Pope's predecessor was apparently killed or certainly died mysteriously before he could investigate. P2 people also involved in very strange ways with Pope John Paul II. The P2 is an expressly fascist organization. All the bankers that are involved with the Vatican Bank were expressly fascist and were using the Vatican Bank money to prop up expressly fascist governments in South and Central America, as well as to aid in the shipping of guns and drugs, also to profit these fascist organizations. And also, we've got Stiebaum, another organization that's made up of Western intelligence and fascists, and is also using its clout for expressly fascist purposes. So now all of these organizations, which all connect into the attempted assassination, are expressly right-wing organizations. And yet somewhere, out of nowhere, comes the Bulgarian theory that says that Pope John Paul II was shot by leftists to try and destabilize the attempt by the Soviet Union to keep peace in Poland, the other way around, that he was shot to enable the Soviet Union to keep peace in Poland. We will examine the possibility of this being true as we go along tonight. But so the main thing to take out of the first 4 broadcasts for tonight's purpose is that everything so far that is tied into the assassination attempt on the Pope is either directly by or paid for by expressly pro-fascist organizations, all the way down the line. Okay, we are going to start. And we are going to start tonight with a long article that was originally presented in Europeo magazine, EUROPEO, of August 17th, 1985. Research credit for this magazine goes to Ted Rubenstein, a researcher that we work with quite a bit, who's provided us with some really fine material. And it was translated by one of our listeners. And it's headlined, "The Aja Case, an alternate truth about the attempt on the Pope's life." The subheading is, "And on the 6th day, the Sismi," that's, remember, is Italian military intelligence, "pointed toward the Bulgarian Trail." There is one story as told by the Turkish terrorist, and there is a second one. It starts with the arrival in Rome of an ex-CIA agent. It culminates with a report from our, meaning the Italian, Secret Service. That version anticipates Aja's version by 1 year. It is February the 3rd, 1981. At 11 a.m., a TWA flight originating in New York arrives at the Rome airport Fiumicino and with a distinguished gentleman aboard. His height approximately 1.7 meters, regular build, reddish hair, no mustache or beard, apparently about 55 years old. This is the description made by an officer of the Italian Secret Service. That distinguished gentleman is Theodore Shackley, a very well-known person. A person very well known by people working for the American counterespionage because he had once commanded one of the most delicate CIA sections, the one called clandestine operations. Shackley did not come to Rome on a pleasure visit, but to meet the directing officers of the Italian security services. The officer that offers him help at customs is executing an order from his boss, General Giuseppe Santavito. Just cut in to say, again, Giuseppe Santavito, very important P2 member, very tight to all of the people we've been talking about so far, and himself the head of the Super Sismi, the parallel Italian military intelligence organization that was working hand-in-hand with P2. From the airport, General Santavito's helper brings Shackley to the Excelsior Hotel in Rome. The trip is made in a Mercedes with civilian license plates. Shackley will stay in the hotel 5 days. This is the beginning of close cooperation between the CIA expert in, quote, clandestine operations and our military secret service, the Sismi. The very same Sismi is today found involved in the obscure and complex story of the attempt on the life of John Paul II. You might ask, what has Shackley got to do with the attempt on the Pope's life? In order to understand this, we need to jump forward 1 year. It is now January the 6th, 1982. A cold, detached American with a big black mustache gets located by some BBC journalists for British television. This is a real journalistic scoop. This gentleman had worked for Shackley. His name is Frank Turple. He is an ex-CIA agent working in clandestine operations. Turple, under the CIA shield, had done a lot of things: arms trafficking, paramilitary camps and arms, technologies, and training for Gaddafi's forces in Libya. But somewhere down the line, he must have made a mistake, or tried without success to outsmart somebody, because he has gotten a 53-year sentence. Of this sentence, he does not serve a single day because, as a good clandestine operations agent, he leaves prison before the sentence is announced. In the interview given to the BBC, among other things, he declares, quote, I trained the Grey Wolves. This is a real shocking statement because, if it's still not known, the Grey Wolves is a dangerous terrorist organization. We might add neo-fascist organization, Nip Tuck puts in parenthetically. A dangerous terrorist neo-fascist organization to which at one point Mehmet Ali Aja, the person who shot the Pope, belonged. But why Turple wants to reveal this now that why does Turple want to reveal this now that the inquiry regarding the attempt on the Pope's life is pointing toward a, quote, Bulgarian trail? Does Turple want to scorn his ex-commander, Theodore Shackley, who is helping the Italian Secret Service go after the, quote, Eastern Trail? Or maybe he said something he did not mean. This statement is not liked by Shackley, or by a third person either. He is a middle-aged man with a mustache and inquisitive eyes. His name is Paul Henze, H-E-N-Z-E. Henze is also well known by the people of the American Counterintelligence Service, and not by them only. He has also been a member of the National Security Council, taking direct orders from the White House. For a number of years, Henze had lived in Turkey. Yes, in the same country as Ajah, where he worked as a director of the local CIA installation. As a consequence of this assignment, he should know a lot of things about the Grey Wolves, at least on an informative level. Paul Henze surely does not appreciate Turpel's television exhibition. Only a few months before the interview, an article had appeared on the American periodical Atlantic Community. In it, for the first time, the Soviets and the Soviet Secret Service, the KGB, are accused of providing Ajah with the training and the weapon. The article was signed by Paul Henze. Well, what sense does that accusation make, especially if we consider the fact that the person who makes it has been the CIA director in Ankara for many years? Okay, just to go back to very quickly recapitulate some of the most important points before Dave continues with the article. Okay, according to this Europeo article, on February of 1981, 11 a.m., well, the time is not so important, Theodore Shackley arrives in Rome to meet with General Giuseppe Santavito. As we are later going to find out, or as we have found out actually already in previous shows, Giuseppe Santavito is going to be taking the fall for a lot of the activities of P2. Expressly, as mentioned before, pro-fascist activities on behalf of P2, having to do with, among other things, the manipulation of the Italian political scene illegally, the promulgation of disinformation, and the attempt to spread fascism. Okay, so Theodore Shackley, former CIA director of clandestine operations, comes to meet with General Giuseppe Santavito. A year later, Frank Turpel, being interviewed by the BBC, says, "I am the man who trained Mehmet Ali Ajah." Now, Frank Turpel is a former employee, or a former subordinate of Theodore Shackley. At the same time, we have Paul Henze, the man who was the former CIA station chief in Ankara, Turkey, where, again, as pointed out, since Mehmet Ali Ajah first burst onto the international scene by shooting a very prominent liberal newspaper editor, Abdi Peki, he certainly knows who Mehmet Ali Ajah is, and he certainly knows who the Grey Wolves are. Now, so we have the quote-unquote former CIA man, Frank Turpel, training the Grey Wolves, or claiming to. We have his former boss in, just about the time of the attempted assassination of the Pope, meeting with General Giuseppe Santavito, head of the corrupt Italian Secret Service, which is linked with all the other strange activities that the Vatican is tied into. And then we have Paul Henze, the former head of CIA station in Turkey, and bear in mind that, as we're going to see later in some detail, the CIA in Turkey has worked very closely with the Grey Wolves. We have Paul Henze writing the first installment of the, quote, Bulgarians tried to kill the Pope theory, unquote.
Now remember that Theodore Shackley was Frank Turpel's, or one of his control agents, when Turpel and Shackley were still working for CIA. After Shackley, we looked at that, by the way, in Radio Free America number 4, our program about Turpel and Wilson. Now, after his formal retirement from the service, from the Secret Service, Shackley went into one, among other things, began to work for a series of corporate fronts set up by Edwin Wilson, who also worked with Frank Turpel in training and arming, among others, Muammar Gaddafi. We looked at Gaddafi's connections with the whole P2 nexus last time. So Shackley is working with Santavito of P2. Shackley is Turpel's control and goes to work for some of the Wilson-controlled corporate fronts after his alleged retirement from CIA, just like Frank Turpel. Continuing now with Europeo from August 17, 1985. The American political scientists are not a bit surprised, talking about, in reference here to Paul Henze's having written the book blaming the Bulgarians for shooting the Pope. The American political scientists are not a bit surprised. They know that Henze belongs to a far-right organization that has three precise objectives: the end of a peaceful coexistence, the consecration of Moscow as the international terrorism capital, and a renewed military buildup. By the way, interrupting that organization is the Committee on the Present Danger. But if the statements that Turpel had given to the BBC were true, how can Henze's accusation stand up, considering the fact that the Turkish Secret Service knew about the Grey Wolves, and notoriously that they are closer to the CIA than to the Secret Service, the Soviet Secret Service? Henze's article appears in Atlantic Community in November of 1981. A few weeks later, of course it is a simple coincidence, Ajah begins a hunger strike. Do you remember what he had said in July when he was given a life sentence? Quote, "If things don't change, I will begin a hunger strike starting December 20th. Unquote. Those were his exact words, interpreted as a precise message to his accomplices as yet unknown. As threatened, on December 20th, he refuses to eat. Not only that, he tries to set his cell on fire in order to get public attention. One curious detail, in the adjoining cell is an American Marine, Michael Cox, arrested in Naples a few days earlier. A few days later, on December 29th, 2 Secret Service agents come to the Ascoli Piceno prison. They talk to Aja. He suspends the strike and toasts to the new year. What did the agents promise him? We're going to come back to that. Surely our Secret Service knows many things about Mehmet Ali Aja. All we need to do is to read the report that the Sismi sent to the Roman magistrates right after the attempt. All of his life, friends, trips, and meetings are recorded and documented. But there is something wrong with the report. What the report is trying to do is to hide a certain truth and to put a lie into evidence. The truth is that Aja is a real gray wolf, and that is not appreciated by the Sismi. The lie consists of a certain friendship with leftist people and organizations. That part is liked by our Secret Service. Let's read the report together. By the way, this report is, again, from a few days after the attempt on the Pope's life. Quote, Aja has had contacts with a still unknown leftist militant right before the attempt on the Pope's life, unquote. And the report continues, quote, this contact was made because of an ideological fracture within the movement he belonged to. And still later, Aja has obtained in Perugia, thanks to a local element, help and protection from the leftist Turk students. They were fully aware of his real identity, unquote. Now you could ask yourself, why is the Sismi trying to create a path going to the left? Is it the same assigned path, unquote, so widely used after the Piazza Fontana massacre? Or is it something different? If we want to try to give an answer, we need to read a second report. Again, it is a Sismi report, and it is dated May 14th, 1981, exactly 24 hours after the shooting of the Pope. This one is not about Aja, but about the probable contact between Vatican and Soviet representatives, unquote. This topic is completely foreign to the attempt on John Paul II and brings up an obvious question. Why are our secret services investigating the matter during the days in which the Pope is fighting for his own life in a hospital bed? We read from a report filed a few weeks before the attempt. Quote, the relative social peace in Poland after the clash between the Solidarity Union and the government has caused the Italian press to publish information that suggests a hypothesis according to which the Soviet Union has given assurances to the Pope that no forces coming from Russia or any other Warsaw Pact country will set foot in Poland. It is possible that even for a moment, the Pope and the Eastern Bloc can get along? Obviously, the Sismi does not think so. But, and this is bad news, quote, the Apostolic See does not deny it, and, quote, we can also start to believe that an approaching process is developing between the Vatican and the Soviet Union. The common points of view are the disarmament of the world and peaceful coexistence. Both sides agree that the American administration is trying to create a new Cold War. Our Secret Service throws accusations at the Soviets. According to the Sismi, it is they that have convinced the Italian press of the good relations between the Vatican and the East. Also according to them, that was accomplished, quote, by a disinformation campaign. This information that has been made public in reality has no foundation in fact, unquote. They're talking now about the Italian press assertions that the Soviets and the Vatican were drawing together. Continuing here. Actually, the press had given prominence to certain initiatives of Pope John Paul II. For the first time, a high prelate had gone to the Kremlin and had been received by Vladimir Zagladin, Z-A-G-L-A-D-I-N, a high party official. He had words of praise for the Pope. Quote, the Pope says that we must stop the arms race. We agree, unquote. Secretary of State Agostino Casaroli had flown to Warsaw and one other time to Budapest to discuss the Polish problems and solidarity. Monsignor Achille Silvestrini has had a meeting in Rome with Zagladin. Can we call all of this a campaign of Soviet disinformation, unquote? Sarcastically, a Soviet political commentator for the Novosti agency, Vladimir Katin, or Katin, K-A-T-I-N, lists as knots, unquote, according to American policies, certain Vatican points of view. Basically, there are 4 of them. First, the Pope is against the arms race begun by Ronald Reagan. Second, the PLO must be included in peace talks in the Middle East. Third, the Pope is against the Israeli annexation of the Arab part of Jerusalem. Fourth, the Pope had received the president of the Salvadorian Democratic Front. So it is not true that the Soviet Union hates the Pope. Or maybe Leonid Brezhnev, the then chief of the Kremlin, had a sudden change of heart toward the Holy See. Just a month before, the events in Poland were way out of control. Maybe the invasion was imminent. But an unusually conciliatory Brezhnev speech, commented on positively all over the world, puts an end to the fears. What had happened? And what weight had that speech had in the relations with the Polish Pope? Is it a slight change of policy? The fact is that 11 days after the attempt, on May 24th, we witnessed two events. The Bulgarian ambassador lays a wreath over the tomb of St. Cyril and Methodius, Europe's protectors of all of Europe from the Atlantic to the Urals, and the Pope, still in the hospital, declares that he hopes to see the creation of a mixed theological commission in order to develop a cultural cooperation between the Holy See and Bulgaria. In other words, there is no sign of Cold War between the Holy See and the East, even after the attempt. The Pope probably does not know the content of a CISMI report recently discovered by the judges. In this report, it is said that the instigator of the attempt is a Soviet minister. This was on May 19th. Okay, before Nip continues with the article, let's go back and review a few of the main points that we've been looking at. We've taken a look, first of all, that Theodore Shackley, formerly Frank Turpel's control when he was working for CIA and a person who bailed out into the same series of Edwin Wilson-controlled corporate fronts as Turpel after his alleged retirement from CIA, he goes to work with Giuseppe Santavito, head of Italian intelligence and a key member of P2 and the Super CISMI group in February, 3 months before the Pope, February of 81, 3 months before the Pope is shot. Frank Turpel then says, "I've trained the Grey Wolves." Paul Henze, former CIA station chief in Turkey, in November of 81, breaks the first piece of public information alleging the so-called Bulgarian connection. Now, in a report that came out right after the Pope was shot, the same CISMI, headed by Giuseppe Santavito, is talking about overtures between the Vatican and the Kremlin, specifically overtures to help ameliorate the situation in Poland, and also overtures between the Kremlin and the Vatican concerning an apparent diplomatic exchange with a Kremlin man named Zagladin, and also apparent Vatican attempts to draw closer not only to Hungary, but worth noting here, also Bulgaria. There was the possibility of a mixed theological commission going from the Vatican to Bulgaria. So in the middle of a number of signs of thawing of the diplomatic and political situation between the Vatican and the Kremlin, the CISMI is aware of this. Apparently, we have records of the CISMI being aware of this right at the time the Pope is being shot. The day after the Pope is shot, CISMI has a report on Mehmet Ali Aja deliberately obscuring his right-wing Grey Wolf contacts, his explicit neo-Nazi contacts. We're going to come back to that a little later, but it's worth noting that at the very time that the Pope is being shot, supposedly because of the things that he's doing to displease the Soviet bloc, in fact, it turns out that the Pope was moving closer to the East Bloc on a number of different subjects, including the arms race, the Middle East, Poland, Bulgaria, and also apparently Hungary as well. So we see a diplomatic situation that would lead us to suspect an opposite line of actions on the part of the Warsaw Pact nations.
Continuing with the Europeo article, and they're going to start off right away with more of this CISMI report that came out the day, as they mentioned, while the Pope is lying in bed fighting for his life. We read, quote, "According to intelligence gathered by foreign press, the attempt on the Pope's life was planned and organized by the GRU, Soviet Military Secret Service, by order of Soviet Defense Minister Marshal Ustinov," unquote. Then there's also 3 pages of documentation. What's written in those is not known. What is known, however, is the fact that if a diplomat got hold of this and read it, the world might suffer serious consequences. What interest is CISMI serving by suggesting the Eastern Path, or the Bulgarian theory, without hard evidences? Did the CISMI acquire good intelligence from a Western Secret Service? Or is it just doing something similar to that international scheme in which Billy Carter, the president's brother, was involved? That involvement gave a boost to the Republican presidential candidate Ronald Reagan. In writing these pages, no diplomatic caution was used. In November 1980, the CISMI says, Ustinov called a secret and restricted meeting in Bucharest of all ministers of the Warsaw Pact countries. During that meeting, he said that the GRU wanted to kill the Pope. Only East Germany approved. That caused some reflection. The Pope would not be killed, only wounded. And it is now that Ali Aja comes on the scene. Quote, "The GRU asked the KGB," says a report, "one of the best available terrorists, in appearance belonging to the right movement, but in reality controlled by the secret organization," unquote. That's, again, from the CISMI report. The chosen one was the Turk Aja, who was among the first on a list of probable candidates. They let Aja escape from a Turkish prison where he was held, quote, and trained in Crimea, unquote, probably in camps near the city of Simferopol. The training consists of shooting a shape in slow motion that was traveling on a Jeep convertible and aiming for the lower part of the body or the legs. In other words, 6 days after the shooting, our CISMI, Italian military intelligence, knows everything of what 1 year later will become, quote, the Bulgarian Trail as, quote, revealed by Aja. Is this not strange? But at that time, the magistrates were still in the dark. Aja keeps quiet. He gets asked a lot of questions, but the only thing that he says is, quote, they wanted. That hints of conspiracy, confirming the assumptions of the magistrates. But that is a plot that leads to a different direction than the one wanted by the CISMI. When Aja is tried for the killing of Abdi Ipeki, the vice director of the newspaper Milliyet, he had said, quote, the secret services protect me. Nothing can happen to me. Nothing can harm me, unquote. And it is logical to think that he was referring to the Western secret services. Obviously, nobody suspected at that point that our CISMI had a parallel structure called Super CISMI. This structure, whose reports are written with the same technique as the one about the attempt on the Pope's life, misguided the investigation regarding the Bologna railway station massacre on August 2nd, 1980. In that case, some German terrorists were accused of the crime, but no evidence was ever found. I should just put in parenthetically, actually, the persons responsible for the Bologna railway station massacre were, among others, Stefano Della Chiai, the noted right-wing fascist terrorist, as apparently under the direction of Licio Gelli, Grand Master of the P2.
Both those same individuals also implicated in the Piazza Fontana massacre, which was blamed on the left, and we've talked about that before. We'll refer back to that later.
At this point, we can rightfully ask ourselves if these two reports, the first regarding the relations between the Vatican and the Soviet Union, and the second about Ustinov's alleged involvement in the attempt on the Pope's life, had been filed for precise use, and used, again, for precise interests, by people who are not only Italian nationals, by people that are not only Italian nationals. And that makes sense. How can it be possible to not let the Allies' secret services know about such an explosive report? During that period, not only was Shackley cooperating with our secret services, there were also other persons coming from the other side of the ocean, among them Michael Ledeen, a person very close to the White House entourage. From this circle of people comes the first suggestion about this whole case. The Times of London receives secret intelligence and makes it public immediately. Quote, experts of the Western secret services, and particularly the Germans, had found circumstantial evidence. On the basis of these evidences, they are convinced that the KGB, or any of its Eastern European satellite secret services, were the instigators of the attempt on the Pope's life. And Aja had not said anything yet. Quote, studying the material at their disposal, adds the Times, the Western information services have not produced hard evidence, but the Germans sustain the thesis formulated by the Vatican and Italian secret services, according to whom Ali Aja is not a lonely attempter, but a part of a conspiracy that was carefully prepared, probably in Eastern Europe. Maybe the Vatican has received the CISMI's report and is convinced of the Soviet trail. In an interview, Secretary of State Agostino Casaroli himself had made mention of an international conspiracy. Quote, a heart, or maybe hearts, has armed the hand of the enemy, unquote. Those were his exact words. But now he does not want to be quoted on it. So it does not confirm the London Times statements. Quote, the Holy See has never formulated hypotheses about involvement of any organization or country who could be indicated as an organizer or inspiration of the attempt on John Paul II. Aja, in the Ascoli Piceno prison, is still silent. He seems like he is playing a role. He promises a hunger strike and keeps his word. He promises to talk, and he will, indicating the Eastern Trail and making the CISMI's informers, and Paul Henze look very good. Henze himself, as soon as Aja starts talking, affirms that the attempt on the Pope's life is, quote, Moscow's Watergate, as well as Yuri Andropov's. After being the first one to accuse the Soviets, he is now worried that this bomb is still not powerful enough to make any damage to the Kremlin's leaders. So, he takes on the Western leaders. He warns them, quote, if they will watch the other side, he writes, if they will not investigate thoroughly, and if they try to salvage the diplomatic relations, Andropov will overcome this difficult moment, and nobody in Moscow will be able to challenge him, unquote. Who knows? Maybe Mr. Shackley, arriving in Rome that February on that TWA flight, had the very same idea. Okay, so the L'Europeo article provided by Ted Rubenstein, translated by one of our listeners, a rather longish article to start with tonight, but an exceedingly important article for a variety of reasons. It talks about, as mentioned, the fact that Seize Me, again, that same Seize Me run by Giuseppe Santavito, who we're going to get back to in a moment, that Seize Me, within practically hours of the assassination attempt on the Pope, within a couple of days, has a report together laying out the entire Bulgarian thesis, which then basically disappears for a year, and then resurfaces in the, well, not a year, about 4 or 5 months, and resurfaces in the hands of Paul Henze, former CIA station chief in Turkey, Mehmet Ali Agha's home stomping grounds, where the CIA is very tight with Mehmet Ali Agha's old stomping buddies, the neo-fascist Grey Wolves. 3 months before the assassination attempt on the Pope, Theodore Shackley, the former boss of the man who trained Mehmet Ali Agha and the Grey Wolves, has arrived in Rome to meet with General Giuseppe Santavito, high-ranking P2 member, and also the head of the Italian Super Seize Me, the secret intelligence network. So what we've got here is a combination of people apparently operating together before and after the assassination, working in remarkably parallel and corroborative way, with passing around the story, again, with seemingly no information whatsoever, that eventually winds up coming out of Mehmet Ali Agha's mouth. As we will find out later in the broadcast, however, there are problems with this because for one reason being that there are certain things that Mehmet Ali Agha offers up in support of this Bulgarian theory that he could not have known, which tends to make it extremely likely that he, in fact, was given this story to tell. Perhaps he did not even receive it until after he had shot at the Pope, which is a question we will examine in some depth. A recast of the entire broadcast is just not feasible, not with 20 hours already in the can and 5 more hours coming tonight. But we are going to try and sum up some of the things that have been covered to give you an idea, or perhaps more importantly, to refresh the memory of those who are just tuning back into that and have perhaps had their minds elsewhere or have not heard all 4 of the other broadcasts yet, or whatever the case might be. Again, to explain to those of you who just tuned in and have heard us explaining a lot of things about the nature of the show and the nature of the kind of broadcasting we do on these archive broadcasts, we want to stress that this is a very special and specific broadcast tonight. This is the last of a 5-part series on what we call the Mediterranean merry-go-round. I can't even say it, and the show's barely started. And the last broadcast on the Mediterranean merry-go-round that we were going to do in this particular series. And the Vatican, again, as we often say, please don't misconstrue references to the Vatican as being references to the Catholic Church as a whole. The Vatican is a temporal organization. It's an actual city-state. It has its own laws. It has its own rulers. And as with anywhere else, when you have mortal men involved with huge amounts of money, power, and political machinations, you have strange things going on, and that is certainly the case here. So the Vatican is one very important track. Another very, very important track is something called the P2, or the Propaganda Due Masonic Lodge. Again, the Masonic Lodge in this case, this should not be confused with Masonry in general. In this case, Masonry is pretty much secondary in importance. The only important thing as far as Masonry is concerned here is the fact that there's a great deal of secrecy surrounding the assassination of John F. Kennedy in terms of complexity, and that was a pretty damn complex case, as those of you who listened to the Guns of November will be aware. But this case goes so far and so wide, and it's involved so many people and so many organizations, and so many bizarre twists and turns are involved that yeah, even we had to edit some stuff in the interest of brevity, which sounds funny when you're talking about 25 hours of radio broadcasting. But to sum up the most important points, basically we are looking at a series of parallel tracks that are only seemingly parallel and are in reality connected. You might almost say there are the above ground tracks and there is the underground railroad that all of them are connected to. But the above-ground tracks are several. One of them, and one of the most important, and one of the things that makes this such an unusual case, is the Vatican itself, inner core of Masonic lodges, and that enabled the people involved in P2, namely a man called Licio Gelli, to recruit and, in fact, blackmail very powerful people from Italy and other countries, but most particularly Italy, into his Masonic lodge for the purpose of shaping a shadow fascist government of Italy with the interest towards reinstating fascism in Italy. Mussolini, Licio Gelli, a former Mussolini functionary and a former Oberleutnant in the Nazi SS. So a man with some serious qualifications toward a fascist coup. So P2, an organization, a secretive organization of very high-ranking military intelligence, business people, and also, of course, some religious people in Italy, but also in a couple of other countries, and with ties to right-wing movements all over the place. That would be the second. The Mediterranean merry-go-round is a phrase we coined to refer to the entire mess that surrounds the assassination attempt on Pope John Paul II in 1981. Now, you might think, well, you know, it was an attempted assassination. Even if there were conspiracies and weird stuff involved, how complicated could it be? Well, the answer is extremely, and I'm sure that those of you who have been following the shows so far realize the truth of what we have said. Those of you who are longtime listeners and are the kind of people who really stay up to date on this stuff will realize that we have had to even leave things out. As a matter of fact, we've had to leave a lot of things out, even with the 25 hours of airtime that we have devoted to these archive broadcasts, because this is probably the largest and most complex political case. I think it even probably leaves in the dust the